Hello, class, and welcome to this is week 6. Time is flying by. Week 6 of government. For the past couple of weeks, we have been talking about Congress, what they do, what they can't do, what they should do. Well, we're going to turn our attention this week to the executive branch. And of course, the executive branch is headed up by the President of the United States. The President is, of course, in addition to being chief executive, also the commander-in-chief of all the military forces, the highest representative our country can send to negotiate or talk with foreign leaders, and is the leader of their political party, whichever one that may be. So, yeah, in addition to being the head of one of the three branches of government, the president has an awful lot of other duties. Small wonder that most people call it the most important, most powerful job in the world. Basically, a president, in addition to, again, enforcing the laws, which is the executive branch's purpose, they head up most of the, what we call the federal bureaucracy. Now, we will talk more about bureaucracy as we go along. As a matter of fact, next week's lesson really takes a deep look at what we call the federal bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is basically the pencil and paper portion of the government, the office enforcement of laws. The president, of course, when we look at the requirements, you remember the requirements for Congress. Requirements for president are a little bit more, little bit stricter, but not that bad. President's got to be 35 years old, have lived in the United States for 14 years, and the big one is the third one, has to be a natural-born citizen. Now, of course, that was in the news when Barack Obama was president, because people like Donald Trump brought up questions about whether or not Obama was actually born in Hawaii. I'll spoil it for you. He was born in Hawaii by every metric, so that was really a non-issue. But if Obama had been born in Africa and was not a natural-born U.S. citizen, he would have been technically ineligible to be president. But everything's cool. He was born in Hawaii. The idea behind that is to make sure that there's very little chance of a foreign element taking control of the executive branch in our government. Of course, a lot of people say Russia's calling the shots now, but again, that's another story and mostly untrue. Now, as we've talked about earlier, presidents are not directly elected by the people. They are chosen or elected by the Electoral College. We all know what that's all about. States have a certain number of electors based on their population and based on, for the most part, the popular vote of a state. Those electors go to candidate A or candidate B. Now, in terms of the states themselves, the states have a certain amount of latitude to decide how to send their electors out. There are two states, Maine and Nebraska, that don't have a winner-take-all system. They instead will take two of their electoral votes, which are the two Senate seats that they have, and give them to the popular vote winner. But other than that, they award electoral votes based on electoral district or congressional district. So, all the time, Maine and Nebraska split their votes. Not a lot of votes. I think Nebraska has 4 and Maine has 5, or vice versa. But yeah, it's they base them according to which congressional districts they win. I kind of like that. That gives a little bit better cross-section, I think, of what the United States public is thinking. But be that as it may, before you even get to that point, though, you have to be nominated by a political party. There are two parties, of course, Republicans and Democrats. You have to be nominated to be a presidential candidate. To win that, you've got to win your party's nomination. And to get the nomination, you have to win a bunch of primaries, state primary elections, or state caucuses, which are basically meetings of party officials at the state level. Sometimes there are state conventions, which are almost like drive-through affairs sometimes. The primaries, caucuses all take place between February and early June of a presidential election year. 35 states have primaries, 8 have caucuses, and sometimes you run into some really arcane rules into how the party distributes delegates. Constitution doesn't tell them how to distribute delegates. They're private political parties. They can award them however the heck they see fit. And it can be a very, very complicated process. And you really have to have people know what the heck's going on to figure out all these arcane old rules or whatever. But the formal nomination takes place at a party convention, usually in the early fall, late summer, early fall of an election year. The party convention is a national meeting of the party. They approve what's called a party platform. That is a series of position statements. The Republican Party believes in A, B, C, D, Z, and goes all the way down. Presidential candidate usually agrees 100% more or less with the party platform. There may be some mild disagreement here and there, but for the most part, the party's platform is going to reflect the views of the person that they nominate to be president. Of course, the national parties have a chance to dominate news coverage for a full week with the party conventions and all that jazz. It used to be the convention, the actual event that they met at, went a long ways towards choosing the presidential nominee. For the most part now, though, the party's nominee is known well before the convention. Someone has clearly gotten the most delegates of the state primaries, caucuses, and conventions, and so there's little or no drama. Usually during the convention or right before, the presumptive nominee will choose their vice presidential candidate. No one runs for vice president. You just happen to get that in the course of running. As you would expect, because the presidency of the United States is arguably the most powerful position on planet Earth, there's a whole lot of money spent to land a job that officially pays you only $400,000 a year. In the 2012 presidential election, each party spent more than $1 billion with a B dollars in their presidential campaign. When you add in all the expenditures for all the other national races, Senate and House, $6 billion was spent on national elections that year, 2012. That was 8 years ago. We are almost certainly going to eclipse that here in 2020, I promise you, by quite a bit. There is a prohibition against who can give to a presidential campaign, but there are people who who are employed specifically to find legal ways around these laws. So yes, big money donations are an issue. And if you think about it, they will always be an issue. Again, government has a lot of power. They have a lot of authority. Therefore, if you are in a private business or even you have a interest of any kind, there is a lot you can gain by getting the government on your side. There's an awful lot that can be gained by having the government in your back pocket. Therefore, there's going to be a lot of effort to curry favor with that government. If the government didn't have so much power, there would be less incentive to spend billions and billions of dollars just to try to get friendly with them. So as long as government has a large amount of authority, and unfortunately I think they will, there's always going to be a way that big money and big influence is going to play a factor. It is impossible to remove that. You can try, and we have tried, but it's not going to happen. There's just simply too much at stake. We mentioned the Electoral College being directly responsible for the election of the president. Few people at the time of the Constitution saw a direct popular election of the president as a good thing, and that's why they invented the Electoral College. The Constitution also allowed state legislatures to decide how to choose their electors. Again, each state has the option, and a lot of states are going the option. Some of them are going to try to end the Electoral College by just giving all of their electoral votes to the national popular vote winner, whoever that may be. The idea is if enough states do that, they can make the Electoral College insignificant. The problem is you've got to change the Constitution to do that. Need 3/4 of the state legislatures to do that ordinarily. And for a lot of small states, they like having this kind of authority. If you live in Wyoming with 3 electoral votes, this is the only time where you're almost on an even keel with some of these larger states. And so the president or whoever's running for president has to pay attention to you because you have electoral votes. There have been some other changes in how Americans elect a president. The original plan turned out to be kind of idealistic and cumbersome. The founders, quite frankly, did not count on the role that political parties would play. They saw the role of political parties in other overseas democracies, and they didn't like them. They didn't explicitly outlaw them, obviously, in the Constitution, but they made no constitutional provision for political parties as such. And again, there's lots of evidence that the Founding Fathers were very, very distrustful of that. Early on, we found out very quickly that the way of electing presidents through an electoral college that was entirely considered by state legislatures was going to be a problem, because originally the Constitution called for the person who got the most electoral votes to be president. The one with the second most electoral votes was vice president. By default, I guess. But yeah, that was the way it was done, and it led to a big standoff in the year 1800, only the third presidential election, where there was a tie for the vice presidency between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And the guy you may have heard of, Alexander Hamilton, was the one who finally crossed lines and said, okay, let's give it to Mr. Jefferson here. And that indirectly really led to his spar there, his duel with Aaron Burr, which was fatal for Mr. Hamilton. But again, by then it was obvious that the constitutional way of electing presidents could be improved. Again, as much as I love the Constitution, it's not perfect. That's why we gave ourselves the means to change it. And change it we did with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. The 12th Amendment, under this plan, electors vote separately for the president and the vice president. When a person votes in a presidential election, you're still actually voting for the electors. For those who are going to the polls on November 3rd, you will not see on the ballot Donald Trump, Joe Biden. It will say electors for Donald Trump, electors for Joe Biden, because that's who you're voting for. You're voting for one of Virginia's 13 electors who are chosen by whichever party gets the most votes in Virginia. Those 13 electors will become part of the Electoral College that will elect our next president. 538 total electors, the 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and, do you remember? 3 for the District of Columbia. They do get 3 electoral votes in this. So, the magic number for 538, the majority, 270. That's the magic number that you will be seeing all across TV screens if you look at any news channel over the next few weeks, because that's the magic number to clinch the presidency. We've told you about each state, of course, awarding their electoral votes in such a fashion. The first real test of the 12th Amendment and how it did things was the 1824 presidential election, where Andrew Jackson actually received the most popular votes, but he did not receive the most electoral votes. That sounds familiar because that's happened 5 times, and that happened in our most recent presidential election. Hillary Clinton actually had 3 million more votes overall than Donald Trump. You know what that means? Absolutely nothing. The Electoral College, which both candidates were trying to win, not the popular vote, the Electoral College, went for Trump because he was able to win some very, very crucial states. Also in the 2000 election, where George W. Bush beat Al Gore by 1 electoral vote in a very close vote in Florida, as it turned out, for the national, like every single vote total, Gore had more total votes, but in the Electoral College, George W. Bush had the advantage. Now, that was a 271 to 269 win for George W. Bush. Now, I remember after of course, it was very closely contested in Florida, and Florida, by a very narrow margin, went to Bush, and that put him over the top, 271. There was, in a group that I was in at the time, this is pre-Facebook, they were suggesting, they were Democrats, and they were suggesting, you know, if we can get a couple of these electors to not vote the way they're supposed to, we can hijack this presidency. That idea was quickly shot down by fellow Democrats. They held the Electoral College with such esteem that to subverted in that way was absolutely unconscionable in the year 2000. Fast forward 16 years, and after Donald Trump evidently beat Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College, Democrats actively asked for electors not to vote for Trump. So in the span of 16 years, the Electoral College went from this sacrosanct, holy thing that you don't mess with to just another political tool, according to people. That's a coarsening of debate. That does not make me optimistic for the future. Hopefully we can stem that. Again, 5 times the candidate who won the national popular vote did not win the election. There are some times when there is even more often the case where a president does not win a majority of votes. You get the third-party candidates, very significant third-party runs in 1992 and 1996 meant that Bill Clinton won 2 terms as president without ever winning the national majority vote. He had what's called a plurality. 42% for Clinton, 41% for Dole, and 8% for Ross Perot. But of course, the Electoral College is how we determine the winner, and Bill Clinton won safe and sound in the Electoral College each time. Again, the Electoral College maintains that all states have some kind of authority. Without it, presidential candidates would probably not pay too much attention to areas without a high population density. Think about it. All you're going is for the most votes. You're going to be spending your time and attention where the most people are, where you get the most bang for your buck. If you're going to broadcast a speech to somebody on a stump, you're going to do it where the most people are so the most people can hear you. You're not going to do it out in the middle of nowhere. So the electoral party system helps us in that respect. The unintended consequence of the Electoral College system is it really maintains the two-party system. It is very, very difficult for a third party to get any electoral votes because you got to win a state. And third-party candidacies, not since 1972 has a true third-party candidate won electoral votes in a presidential race. All right, next lesson is after you become president. Being very optimistic here, obviously. There have been 44 presidents now in U.S. history, and they have come from all walks of life. Not going to ask you to remember any of this, but the oldest president was Ronald Reagan when he was 70, but that was eclipsed by Donald Trump, who was 72 when he was elected a couple of years ago. 8 presidents have been born in Virginia. That's the record. Most have had some kind of military or political experience before becoming president. Again, Donald Trump very much the exception there. The average age of presidents when they took office, 53. Tallest president, Abe Lincoln, 6 feet 4 inches tall. The shortest, James Madison, 5 feet 4 inches tall. Again, not going to require you to remember any of this, but because there are only 44 people in this club, presidential trivia is kind of a thing here. Again, as we mentioned earlier, the actual salary for a president is $400,000. George Washington's salary originally, he was the first president, was $25,000 a year. Now, of course, in addition to the $400K, there are lots of other perks to being president. No one runs for the president for the salary. Of course, you get to live in this big, beautiful house, the White House, rent-free. You get the Camp David retreat to use at your discretion. You get money for staff, travel expenses. But again, no one's running for president because you get paid a 6-figure salary. No, you're getting paid because you get more power than any other living, breathing creature on the planet. The vice president has been called the most insignificant office ever. And again, in terms of constitutionally stated duties, the vice president has only one, and that is as president of the Senate. And even then, the only thing a vice president can do in the Senate is break a tie. So if the vice president were truly doing exactly what the Constitution said that they could do, they wouldn't be doing anything except waiting around for a tie vote in the Senate. Again, no one campaigns for vice president. Vice presidents are chosen by the presidential nominees for their ability to attract voters that the president probably could not reach. If the president is a an urban cowboy from Texas. He's not going to choose another urban cowboy from Texas on a party. He's going to be choosing some small farmer from Maine or Washington State or something like that. Again, to kind of what they call balance the ticket.
And hello again. Do not adjust your computers or your devices, iPad, iPod, whatever you're watching this on. I'm doing a live edit here because in the 2020 video, I referenced a whole lot of stuff that has actually changed. This is this dynamic situation here. There's a couple of references in the first part of this video to the 2020 election, which I hope you will ignore. The next thing we're going to talk about is presidential succession, and this is something that's come up recently, recent enough for me to update this video on the presidency. For a while, we were losing presidents in office at about a rate of 1 every 20 years, either being assassinated or dying of natural causes. And it has caused us to look at the orderly transition process. What you do when a president is no longer alive or, the possibility of no longer able to carry out their duties. In 1841, this happened the first time with William Henry Harrison dying in office, and it was assumed by many that John Tyler, his vice president, would simply fill in as president until something happened. But no, everybody looked back at the Constitution and said, the way this reads, the vice president takes over immediately after the president passes away. It made no provision for Tyler to do anything about his own vice president. So that was something that they had to address legislatively. And anyway, they figured it out, and there have been a whole lot of changes since then. For the longest time, the line of succession, that is to say, president, vice president, who comes next, was president, vice president, cabinet members, then the leadership of Congress. Well, that was changed in 1947 after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the current order of presidential succession, which you see here, is what we have right now. Again, as I record this video, there is no Speaker of the House. Kevin McCarthy was ousted from that position a couple of weeks ago, and they have not been able to settle on a replacement. So, if the worst were to happen now, if Biden and Harris were no longer able to serve, I don't know what we would do. I mean, we can't go to the Speaker of the House because there is no Speaker of the House. My interpretation of this is we would go to President Pro Tem of the Senate. It'd be Chuck Schumer in that case. So, yeah, again, this is a sort of a weird time here. And the Constitution, again, has been changed to reflect this. For about 14 months after John F. Kennedy was shot, there was no Vice President of the United States. Lyndon Johnson was immediately sworn in after Kennedy died, but there was no Vice President for 14 months. Again, in 1965, though, Congress addressed this with the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which states that in the case of a vacancy in the office of President, the Vice President shall become President. When the office of Vice President is vacant, the President shall nominate a successor who has to be approved by a majority vote of each House of Congress. That's a pretty low threshold there. Now, the President has to notify the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem or the Senate if they're going to be temporarily unable to carry out the duties of office. This happened in 2002. Most people didn't know about it. George W. Bush, president at the time, had to have minor surgery, but he was going to be under anesthesia for a few hours. So Dick Cheney became the Vice President of the United States. The Vice President became the acting president for a few hours one day in 2002. And again, it was no big deal, but again, officially you have to do this. So for a few hours, we were led by interim President Dick Cheney. The idea is that, again, you see all the list of all the cabinet heads, the likelihood of all of them not being around at one point is makes for a good TV series. I don't know if you ever saw Designated Survivor. It kind of worked on that. They always take one member of the cabinet and do not have him attend or her attend the State of the Union speech, and all that happened. But anyway, this new amendment to the Constitution was immediately utilized in 1973 when President Nixon nominated House Minority Leader Gerald Ford to replace the Spiro Agnew, who had resigned as vice president. And so it was the first time first time a vice president had ever resigned. And so Gerald Ford became the vice president of the United States. Of course, 9 months later, Nixon resigns, and Gerald Ford becomes president without ever having run for president or vice president. He picked New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. So that constitutional amendment has been used. The president, of course, one of the chief duties is the commander of the military forces. The president is called in the Constitution the commander-in-chief. He heads up the National Guard as well. Now, it's important to note that the president is a civilian. They are not a member of the military. The Constitution went through great pains to make sure that our military, our standing armies, were not ultimately led by military people, but they were led by civilians. They did not want a powerful standing army that was answerable only to itself. And of course, again, if you think about the context in which the Constitution was written, right after they had successfully prosecuted a war of independence, you can see how they were a little leery of standing armies. The war-making authority of the federal government is a big example of separation of powers in the Constitution. Only Congress has the power to declare war, but the operation of the armed forces in the field is under the oversight of the president. So Congress declares the war, the president carries it out in those instances. Now, that's the way it's written down. It doesn't always work that way. The presidents, over the course of the years, have increasingly come to initiate their own military action without Congress making a formal declaration of war. Matter of fact, Congress has only declared war 5 times. 1812 against Great Britain, 1846 against Mexico, 1898 against Spain, and in both world wars in 1917 and 1941, the U.S. has been involved in some long, protracted military affairs where no war was declared. We never declared war on Vietnam, never declared war on Afghanistan after 9/11. We never declared war on Iraq, but we went in and ousted Saddam Hussein anyway. Never declared war in Korea, even though we were embroiled in military action there for about 3 years. But a lot of presidents have used military force. Thomas Jefferson authorized the attacks on the Barbary pirates across the coast of northern Africa. Of course, President Lincoln commanded the vast army of the United States government in the Civil War. There was never a war declared against the South. So, a conflict that took 700,000 American lives, Congress never declared war. A few people will question a president's use of troops to, like, say, rescue American citizens or to protect embassies. Congress, though, has slowly backed away from their role in this separation of power. Congress gave President Lyndon Johnson what was called a AUMF, Authorization for the Use of Military Force in Vietnam. The nation's experience in Vietnam, not a very positive one, brought about a change of policy in this respect. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed by Congress, which gave President Johnson, a whole lot of authority in Vietnam, and that left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, mostly because of the way the war played out. 1973, Congress, in the wake of that, passed what was called the War Powers Act. President Nixon actually vetoed it. He thought it was unconstitutional. Well, Congress overrode his veto. Basically, it says the president has to inform congressional leaders within 48 hours of any military action they order. They also have to withdraw troops within 60 days unless Congress specifically approves of the action he has taken. Congress asserting some of its authority in this balance and separation of powers. Again, the President Nixon thought it was unconstitutional. It has not been ruled unconstitutional by any court. Now, again, then you get to the definition of what is military force? What is combat? What if I'm just sending a few troops over there to protect American interests? What if I'm just sending peacekeepers, my favorite euphemism, over there. Again, Congress has not been told of a lot of military activities that have taken place in the last 50 years. President Reagan sent troops to Grenada, to El Salvador for very differing reasons. Again, the United Nations and our commitments to that group as a nation also complicate things. We get UN resolutions passed for use of force against Iraq because of their invasion of Kuwait in 1990. 1991, Bill Clinton sent UN peacekeeping troops, including American forces, into Bosnia and Kosovo as they were undergoing a lot of ethnic strife. Of course, in the days after 9/11, it was a UN resolution and a congressional AUMF authorization for the use of military force that was granted to then President George W. Bush. We never declared war on Osama bin Laden or anyone else for that matter, but it was an authorization for the use of military force. And again, Congress really did not step up and after 20 years tell the subsequent presidents, hey, we gave you this authorization for use of military force, we're still using it. How about an update on this? So yeah, you can see where that separation of power is still very much being debated. There's a whole lot about the way the Constitution works that is up for interpretation, and of course, whoever the president is going to try to get as much power as they can. Whoever's in Congress is going to try to angle for power. That is the nature of the beast. President, of course, in his role as a chief executive of the United States, is also the chief diplomat. They can meet with foreign leaders, and they do all the time. They can offer up treaties that have to be ratified by Congress. Again, separation of powers. President can sign what's called an executive agreement with another country, commits the U.S. to a certain course of action, but it does not require Senate approval. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, is an example of that. It wasn't a treaty, it was an agreement. Sounds like a treaty, trade treaty, but again, you see always that little battle there going on between the executive and the legislative. And I like them when we're still sort of at odds, not necessarily actively against each other, but still each asserting their power, neither getting much more powerful than the other. Although I would say the presidency has gotten very much the upper hand in the past few generations. The lesson 29 is entitled "The President as Chief Executive." Again, the president's main duties is to carry out the laws that Congress passes. That's the entire business of the executive branch. To do that, the federal bureaucracy right now includes 15 cabinet departments. We used to call it the Department of War. Now it's the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Education. You get the idea. And of course, staffing all this are a whole lot of federal employees. The number of civilian employees at last check was around 3 million. And about 2.9 million of them are in the executive branch. Again, when they talk about the federal bureaucracy, it's almost always the executive branch. Again, the branch that is tasked with carrying out the execution and enforcement of laws. If you add the military to that, and they're not considered direct federal employees, but if you add the military to that, it's well over 5 million people employed by the U.S. government. So about 1 in every 88 people that live in the U.S. is employed by the federal government. It's a lot of people. The cabinet members, the chairmen, are, of course, nominated by the president, whoever the president is, and they have to be ratified by the Senate. Again, checks and balances, check on power. Matter of fact, even though there's a Democratic president right now, Joe Biden, and a Democrat-led Senate, it's a very narrow Democratic majority in the Senate. It's a 51-49 majority. There are 2 Democratic senators who are very moderate who have helped the Republicans shoot down a couple of Joe Biden's nominees to head up federal agencies or have high-ranking positions in those agencies because they felt they were way too far on the political left. So again, checks and balances still working even when Democrats control both the White House and the Senate. That still acts as a check to make sure that we don't go too far one way. And I put a star on this in your book because this is oh so true. The federal bureaucracy has developed a life of its own that does not depend on who is president or what party controls Congress. Certain politicians today refer to that as the swamp because the federal bureaucracy is largely consists of professionals who are hired one day, and it's very hard to fire them. That most federal employees are like that. Once upon a time, years ago, before this thing got super big, the president not only appointed all of the cabinet heads, but he appointed every single person that worked in those departments. Now, we were talking about thousands of employees instead of millions in those days. But once upon a time, the president appointed all of those. It was called the spoils system. You've heard the saying, to the victor go the spoils. Well, whoever won the presidential election gets to hand out federal jobs like candy to all of his cronies. That lasted until 1883. Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which created a professional bureaucracy. And it greatly limited the president's authority to fill all these federal positions with his or her boys. Laws also do limit the political activity of those who are federally employed. There are certain restrictions. They're not terribly onerous, but they do have to. There are some things they cannot do politically speaking because they are federal employees. The president still can appoint the heads of these agencies, but the rank and file member are professionals. They're hired and they stay there presumably until they leave or retire. In addition to that, there is the White House bureaucracy. Just the office of the president and his staff is about 4,000 people. The executive office of the president was created by FDR, and basically it is all the president's men, all the people that work directly for the White House. Not Congress, not the government, but the White House, whoever the president is at that time. Office of National Drug Control Policy, Office of Management and Budget, National Security Council is directly under the White House. A lot of extra alphabet government agencies that work for the president directly under the auspices, but they're all in the executive branch. I put parentheses around the subtitle of executive orders because that has been a political sore spot for the past generation. That's a tool the president can use to carry out the laws that Congress passes. All presidents have used executive orders to guide what the federal government does and how they do it. Some of them are excellent. The U.S. military was integrated not by an action of Congress, but by an executive order from Harry S. Truman. The president has a certain amount of authority to decide how this federal bureaucracy operates, what they do and what they cannot do. Where we have gotten into some situations in recent years are presidents using executive orders to essentially pass new law. And that goes too far. That is unconstitutional. President Barack Obama did not, comparatively speaking, issue a lot of executive orders, but he issued two that courts struck down as unconstitutional because, again, separation of powers. President, you cannot make law. You can only enforce it. And they ruled a couple of his executive orders fell under the umbrella of him making law and not simply enforcing it. Again, the president has got to work with Congress to a degree, or so they're supposed to. Again, there's always going to be that friction. There's even friction even when Donald Trump was president as a Republican and both houses of Congress were led by Republicans. There was still a lot of friction because the direction Congress wanted to go into was sometimes different than the president and vice versa. Final power of the president, pardons. It took me a long time. When I was a kid was when Gerald Ford pardoned President Nixon after Nixon resigned. And I was very young then, and I thought, pardon, what is that? Is it like begging pardon or something? No, pardon is forgiveness of a conviction. The only conviction that a president, only federal conviction, that a president cannot pardon is an impeachment. Of course, no one's ever been convicted, impeached and convicted. But anything else president can do, usually a few days before they leave office, they set a whole bunch of people free, or at least, commute their sentence or something. They're these are sometimes very unpopular, and I really don't like this authority for the president, but it's in the Constitution. I think it is It's too much. I think it is too much. But anyway, they don't ask Chuck what he likes. The final section is on this, again, this battle between the executive and the legislative. Just a quick recap. Again, there are checks and balances built into the Constitution to make sure the executive doesn't get a lot more power than the legislative and vice versa. Executive branch draws up the federal budget. Congress has to pass it. Congress passes laws. The president enforces them. The vice president serves as presiding officer of the Senate. The president, of course, is can approve treaties, but the Senate has to ratify. So again, all that series of, all right, you can do this, but you got to make us happy, vice versa. And, again, it's part of that delicate balance that we're still trying to figure out the sweet spot, and we always will, because that's always going to change a little bit for the times. In the early days of the Republic, it was undeniable that Congress had most of the power. Matter of fact, unless you are one of those who memorizes the names of the presidents, a lot of them in the 19th century, you don't remember because Congress was where the power was. In the moving and shaking in the first half of the 19th century, 1800, 1850, Congress had most of the power. They were the ones making law for a new nation. There were notable exceptions. Andrew Jackson overstepped his role a bit. Of course, by necessity, Abraham Lincoln, when the Civil War came about, had to exert a lot of authority because of the wartime crisis. But most of the presidents of the 19th century were pretty unremarkable because they basically carried out the duties of the president. And, Congress passes the law, we enforce it, that's that. Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century marked a change in thought for the presidency, insofar as he saw the presidency as this great opportunity to do good. And so he had a very active presidency, which challenged Congress on lots of issues. He was a reformer who wanted to use this position as president as more than just somebody who carried out laws, but who actively participated in societal change. That picked up steam with Woodrow Wilson. 20 years later, he wanted to see Congress pass specific reforms. He was very, very aggressive and progressive. And then it went to the nth degree with FDR getting elected in the midst of the Great Depression. Whatever shackles were on the presidency disappeared then because he authorized a whole lot of new federal programs and really, really represented a sea change in the way, not only the way we saw the presidency, but in many ways the way people saw the role of federal government. No longer were people saying, government, you stay over here in your corner, we'll do this. Government stepped to the forefront. I don't like that. But that's the way history is, and if I told you any differently, I'd be lying to you. One of the requirements of the Constitution is that the president must present the Congress every year what's called a State of the Union. Now, for years, presidents did not give a speech to Congress. Matter of fact, they just would mail a report. When they did speak, sometimes it was not the president. Thomas Jefferson was a terrible public speaker, and he had one of his secretaries, Meriwether Lewis, go over there and give the State of the Union address. Woodrow Wilson, really the first modern president to address Congress in person for the State of the Union. Now it's become, of course, a big to-do. Again, a very heavy rah-rah session for the president, telling you why him and his party is the greatest things in the world, and they could do even more if these pesky members of the other party would just let them. It's sort of a useless waste of time now. Again, just an unnecessary jingoism event. Congress already knows what the heck is going on. But again, it's in the Constitution, and so until somebody changes it, you will see it. Again, Congress and the president don't have to work hand in hand. Again, the Constitution ensures that there's going to be competing interests there sometimes. But in order to get things done, they're going to have to work together to some degree. Bill Clinton, I thought, was a very good president when it came to reaching out to Congress, working with congressional leaders to get policy passed. George W. Bush was less effective. Barack Obama was not interested in that. Neither was Donald Trump. Joe Biden has tried on a few things with a couple of the spending bills. He worked with Congress, but the trend is for the president to try to sell their plans to the American people and bypass Congress. Congress is seen as an impediment. When you have that, you know, executive and congressional at loggerheads, you'll sometimes get what's called gridlock. If you're familiar with traffic terms, I sort of like gridlock. Sometimes I feel the less Congress does, the better. But gridlock, of course, is just a symptom of, again, separation of powers. Each side trying to assert their dominion, and sometimes it's going to lead to gridlock. We had a question last week from not from the class, but from adults about the line item veto. Again, the line item veto does not exist for the president. Matter of fact, in 1998, the Supreme Court struck down the proposed line item veto bill as unconstitutional. The court held the Constitution gave the president a right to veto legislation, yes or no, but not parts of legislation, because they felt that if they let a president go through a budget and go yes, yes, no, change this, add this, subtract this, then he's essentially crafting law. And he is, if you think about it. Governor of Virginia can line item the General Assembly's veto, send it back to him, but the president can't do that. That is a violation of separation of powers, so thank God somebody still thinks separation of powers is a thing. Hope you enjoyed part 2 and part 1 of this video. We'll see you on Monday.